imagine paying 2 million birr.
Right, which is roughly the price of a luxury car.
Exactly, 2 million birr just for your child's 8th grade tuition. Because you're buying a specific, globally recognized curriculum.
A ticket to the global stage, basically.
Yeah. And then, right in the middle of the school year, the government just steps in and essentially says, that product you bought, yeah, we're changing the formula. Your kids are taking national exams now.
Which is just a massive shock to the system.
Completely. Welcome to this week's Deep Dive. We're coming to you straight from the newsroom of Addis Fortune, which is Ethiopia's largest English weekly newspaper.
And we've got a lot to get through today.
We really do. Our mission for today's deep dive is unpacking the fascinating and honestly sometimes chaotic friction between sweeping government policies and the messy on-the-ground reality.
It's that classic gap, between policy design on paper and actual policy execution in the real world.
Right. And we're going to see that everywhere today. We're looking at an identity war brewing in elite international schools, a totally chaotic rollout of tax receipts.
Oh, the tax receipt story is wild.
It really is. Plus, some absurd government procurement blunders and a really heavy looming financial crisis in the post-war Tigray region.
Yeah, it's a packed edition this week.
And for you listening, whether you're, navigating corporate compliance at work or just trying to get the best education for your kids, this tension between the rules and real life is just a universal struggle. Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to start in what might be the most visceral arena where state policy meets personal reality.
The classroom.
Yes. Specifically, the ultra-elite international schools in Addis Ababa.
Right, and to really grasp the scale of the disruption here, you have to look at the demographics. Currently, there are 46 schools in the country carrying that international label.
46.
Yeah, but according to the Ministry of Education, only 6 of them actually meet prescribed international standards.
Wait, only 6 out of 46?
Only 6. And here is the kicker. Out of about 21,000 students enrolled in this subsector, a massive 83.5% are Ethiopian nationals.
Wow. Which, that fundamentally changes what these schools actually are. Decades ago, these were built primarily for expatriates, right? Like diplomatic communities.
Exactly.
But today, they're overwhelmingly serving domestic, very affluent Ethiopian families. And we are talking about serious money moving through this sector.
Oh, absolutely.
It generates over 10 billion birr annually. At the very top end, the International Community School, ICS, charges over 2 million birr a year for upper grades.
2 million birr is just staggering, especially when mainstream private schools might charge, anywhere from 20,000 to 80,000 birr.
Right, so it's a completely different stratosphere.
It creates this enormous social and economic enclave. And the government is looking at this and seeing a highly influential segment of the next generation operating completely outside the national framework. So the Ministry of Education, led by Minister Professor Brahanu Nega, is stepping in with this sweeping reform.
Right, the Curricula Plus initiative.
Yeah, Curricula Plus.
Which sounds like a harmless upgrade, like a streaming service or something. But mechanically, it's a massive shift. The ministry is pushing a new rule requiring these schools to maintain at least a 30% enrollment of foreign nationals just to keep their international label.
Which is a huge hurdle for most of them.
Huge. Plus, under this new directive, the national curriculum becomes the main pedagogical framework. The international programs, like Cambridge or the IB, they become supplements.
Yeah, they're essentially layering national exams right on top of an already rigorous global track.
Which sounds exhausting for the kids.
It is. But you have to look at the ideological battle driving this. The ministry isn't just trying to annoy wealthy parents. They argue that this is about national identity, cultural continuity.
They want these kids to know their roots.
Exactly. They're deeply concerned that these elite schools are producing students who might be academically brilliant on a global scale, but are totally culturally detached from their own country.
Right, like they can name a dozen foreign authors, but know nothing of their own heritage.
Precisely. They can analyze Western history, but struggle to name Ethiopian historical figures.
I hear that. I really do. But I have to push back a bit on behalf of the parents here, because if you read the interviews in Addis Fortune with parents like Bethlehem Tekel and Sadenya Mare, they are panicking.
Oh, they're terrified.
And frankly, I would be too. It's like paying for a first-class international flight, getting up in the air, and suddenly the pilot announces you're being rerouted for a mandatory domestic tour.
That's a good way to put it.
If parents are paying up to 2 million birr for a specific global pathway because they want their kids competing for spots at MIT or Oxford, don't they have a legitimate point when they demand what's on the label?
What's fascinating here is how you frame that. You can certainly look at it as a consumer transaction. But the ministry's perspective is that education isn't just a private consumer good. It's a national security and development issue.
Right. The state has a vested interest.
Exactly. They're asking, what good is an elite class that has no cultural roots in the country they're eventually supposed to lead?
Yeah, that makes sense.
But to your point about the disruption, the parents' fears are incredibly valid. Rapidly shifting a child's pedagogical foundation is risky. Suddenly requiring an 8th grader who's only ever known the Cambridge system to just sit for unfamiliar national exams is incredibly jarring.
Yeah, one parent pointed out that surviving Cambridge is demanding enough without bolting a whole new national requirement onto the chassis.
It's a lot of pressure.
And this friction really boiled over at a meeting on March 4th, 2026. You had the minister, angry parents, and PTA representatives all in one room.
I can imagine the tension in that room.
Oh, it was intense. Parents started questioning the legal basis of these sudden changes, even threatening court action. And Professor Berhanu-Nega's response was just incredibly blunt.
What did he say?
He basically looked at them and said, "Go for it."
Wow, just go ahead and sue us.
Yeah. He made it crystal clear that designing and enforcing the curriculum is squarely the ministry's legal mandate. No private group's economic considerations are going to override what he sees as the national interest.
That is a very firm line in the sand. Though, educator McBib Tasso raised a vital structural point in the reporting. He asked, where did this 30% foreign national threshold even come from?
Right. Is there any actual data supporting it?
Exactly. Is there a single shred of empirical evidence? Think about the mechanics of a classroom. Does the physical presence of 20 foreign students versus 2 foreign students actually change the academic delivery for the Ethiopian student sitting in the 3rd row?
Probably not. It feels like an arbitrary metric just designed to force compliance rather than actually improve education.
Yeah. And McBib warns about the macroeconomic blowback too. If these arbitrary rules cause standards to drop, affluent families aren't just going to accept it. They have the means to simply relocate their kids abroad.
And then you lose the money and the talent.
Right. The country doesn't just lose the 10 billion birrs circulating locally. It suffers massive capital flight and loses its future talent pool entirely.
It's a massive high-stakes game of chicken. But, this top-down insistence on controlling the standard doesn't stop at the classroom door.
Not at all.
It bleeds right into how the government tries to modernize its own administrative machinery. Let's look at what happens when the state tries to mandate a high-tech reality but hits a physical brick wall. I am talking about the QR code tax rollout.
Oh, this is a textbook case of technological ambition completely outstripping physical infrastructure.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The Ministry of Revenue wants to fight tax evasion and improve transparency, right?
Which is desperately needed.
Absolutely. So they mandate a rollout of new, secure, QR-coded tax receipts.
And mechanically, that makes perfect sense. A QR code provides traceability. It makes compliance audible. It makes fraudulent duplicate receipts much harder to generate.
If you want to modernize the economy, you digitize the paper trail.
Exactly. But the fatal flaw here isn't the software. It's the physical supply chain. There is only one state-owned printer authorized to handle this secure printing.
Just one.
Just one. The Berhana Salam Printing Enterprise.
One printer for the entire metropolitan tax system. Initially, planners thought they only needed about 700,000 receipt pads, but when the mandate hit, demand from businesses exploded to 2.5 million pads.
They were totally unprepared.
Completely. Suddenly, you have over 2,000 taxpayers stuck in a massive bottleneck, physically waiting for these mandatory receipts just so they can legally conduct business.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it proves that good policy completely fails if the logistical infrastructure can't support the mandate. You have a federal revenue modernization drive pushing absolute compliance on one end.
But a printing monopoly that is physically incapable of keeping up on the other.
Right. And commerce doesn't just politely pause while a printer catches up. If businesses can't issue receipts, goods don't move, and taxes don't get collected.
Which leads to absolute institutional breakdown. Because of these severe delays, local city bureaus, and we're talking more than 130 sector bureaus in Addis Ababa alone, they started going rogue.
Going rogue with tax receipts.
Yes. They couldn't get the official QR-coded receipts from the central printer, so they just fired up their own printers. They started issuing their own withholding and revenue collection receipts just to keep the local economy breathing.
Which completely vaporizes the entire premise of the initiative. The whole point of a secure, centralized QR system is to stop unauthorized printing.
I know. The irony is painful.
But because the bottleneck was so severe, the government's own local bureaus became the unauthorized printers. They lost control over the sequencing and the auditability.
Yeah, Abdulkadir Redwan, the head of the city's finance bureau, had to urgently step in and crack down. He was forced to centralize all the in-house printing right at the finance bureau just to stop duplicate receipt numbers from completely flooding the system.
Unbelievable.
I mean, for you listening, imagine your company rolling out a mandatory new software system that's supposed to streamline everything. But the servers crash, your computer freezes, and suddenly every department head is just bypassing the system and using pen and paper to get their jobs done.
Everyone's experienced something like that.
Right. That's exactly what happened here. But on a municipal scale, the high-tech anti-fraud measure literally triggered decentralized fraud just to keep logistics moving.
It highlights a critical, often ignored lesson in governance. You cannot mandate modernization without first building the physical capacity to deliver it.
Exactly. The intent was absolute transparency, but the execution created an environment perfectly ripe for confusion. Okay, so the QR code story shows a system choking on its own bottleneck. But let's look at a scenario where the state actually recognizes its rules are actively crushing the private sector, and they hit the undo button.
A rare moment of unwinding the chokehold.
Yes. Let's talk about the Federal Public Procurement Service, or PPS.
This is a massive shift. We're talking about the vital supply lines for federal budget institutions and public universities. This system handles tens of billions of birr, and it has been notoriously rigid for years.
Right. If you were a supplier who won a government contract, you were hit with this brutal rule. You had to park 10% of the contract's total value in a non-interest-bearing bank account for 3 full years.
As a performance deposit.
Yes. But Addis Fortune is reporting that the PPS has finally slashed that mandatory deposit down to 3%. And they've tied it to 1-year agreements for individual products instead of blanket 3-year lockups.
To understand why this is such a massive relief, you have to look at the macroeconomic environment these suppliers are surviving in. Ethiopia is dealing with severe, sustained inflation and crushing foreign currency shortages.
It's a really tough market.
Very tough. Think about the mechanics from a business perspective. If you're operating on razor-thin margins and the government forces you to lock up 10% of your working capital for 3 years, paying 0 interest.
While inflation is skyrocketing.
Exactly. Your capital is literally evaporating while it sits in that account. It's a recipe for guaranteed bankruptcy.
It's absurd. I mean, imagine a friend making you put down a massive cash deposit for a group trip 3 years in advance. Over those 3 years, the price of flights and hotels triples, but your friend refuses to adjust the budget.
And you're just stuck.
Right. And then, when it's time to go, they order 500 pizzas when you only needed 50 and expect you to foot the bill. You'd go completely broke.
And that pizza analogy isn't even an exaggeration of how these government agencies operate.
No, it's really not.
The demand distortions generated by these public institutions are staggering. Look at the data from the recent procurement meeting. There was a case where a university ordered over 480 UPS units and 300 computers.
Wow.
The supplier secures the goods, locks up the massive 10% collateral based on that huge order, and then it turns out the university's actual practical need was somewhere around 75 to 100 units.
Unbelievable. So they tied up 3.5 million birr of a supplier's money in collateral for a 36 million birr contract for equipment they didn't even need.
Exactly.
Mintas Not Tessera, the general manager of Baleyap Motors, he laid out the reality of this. Suppliers are already getting crushed just trying to get goods into the country. They're battling import constraints, checkpoint charges, spiking transport costs.
And on top of that, when inflation hits, federal agencies are notoriously slow to approve price adjustments.
Which introduces an incredibly dangerous moral hazard into the system.
Definitely. Think about the incentives here. A procurement system completely breaks down if market prices move faster than the bureaucratic adjustment mechanisms. If a supplier does the math and realizes they're going to take a massive loss fulfilling a contract, they have an overwhelming financial incentive to just stall the delivery.
Exactly. Why rush to deliver a product that's going to bankrupt you? Or they just cut their losses and withdraw entirely. A university president at the meeting actually noted that suppliers were unexpectedly abandoning contracts, disrupting essential campus services like student catering.
It's a complete breakdown of trust on both sides. The supplier feels exploited and trapped by outdated rules, and the public institution feels cheated when the critical goods never arrive. By dropping the capital lockup to 3% and shortening the time frame, the government is essentially waving a white flag. They're admitting their own inflexible rules were actively breaking the supply chain.
It's refreshing, honestly, to see a bureaucracy recognize its own friction and adjust to reality. But that brings us to our final story from this week's edition. In the procurement sector, the government adjusted the rules. But what happens when standard rules aren't adjusted? What happens when regular banking practices violently collide with the total destruction of a post-war economy?
We are looking at the Tigray regional state. And what's brewing there is a looming loan crisis that is threatening to spill over and infect the wider national financial system.
The numbers coming out of the Tigray Chamber of Commerce are just grim. They sent a desperate appeal directly to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Across 616 bank branches operating in the region, outstanding non-performing loans, or NPLs, are climbing toward 80 billion birr.
80 billion birr. And we have to impartially look at the timeline of how we got here. Before the war erupted in late 2020, these businesses were fully functioning cogs in the national economy. They created jobs, paid taxes, routinely serviced their debts.
Right.
Then, a brutal 2-year conflict completely shattered the commercial base. Factories were looted, supply chains evaporated. The Pretoria Agreement in November 2022 was vital because it stopped the hostilities. But a peace treaty doesn't magically rebuild a bombed factory or repair a devastated balance sheet.
Right, the bullet stopped, but the debt just kept growing. And the core friction here comes from a 2021 directive that demands borrowers pay interest on loans that haven't been serviced for 3 years.
Now, the Macroeconomic Committee did try to help. They extended repayment deadlines twice, with the final one set for December 2025.
But as the chamber accurately points out, simply moving a deadline on a calendar doesn't fix the underlying physical reality. The revenue-generating assets are literally gone. And now the grace periods are ending, and banks are starting to foreclose.
The human cost of enforcing these standard banking rules in a post-war zone is profound. Addis Fortune highlighted the story of Wold Mahari, a rebar importer. He has 10 children to support, and he's currently losing 3 houses to foreclosure by M-Pesa Bank.
3 houses?
Yes. But the truly tragic part of the collateral mechanism is that only one of those houses is actually his. The other 2 were pledged by friends and family to support his business loan. Because of this one default, 14 children across those 3 households are at immediate risk of losing their homes.
So what does this all mean? I mean, I look at Wold's situation and think, obviously the banks need to back off. But if banks just forgive 80 billion birr in loans, what happens to the entire financial system? What happens to the everyday citizens whose life savings actually funded those very loans?
This raises an important question, and it represents the ultimate stress test of any financial system.
Yeah.
We have to look at the bank's perspective impartially here, as articulated by Demesu Kasa of the Ethiopian Bankers Association.
Right. What's their stance?
The banks argue quite accurately that they already absorbed massive hits and provided nearly 2 years of relief. But fundamentally, commercial banks are not charities. They are highly leveraged institutions with a strict fiduciary and legal duty to protect their depositors.
Yeah, the millions of birr that Wold borrowed wasn't just printed out of thin air by M-Pesa Bank. It is the pooled savings of everyday people, pensioners, small businesses.
Exactly, people who trusted the bank to protect their money.
So you have a completely impossible zero-sum situation. The Chamber of Commerce is terrified of mass bankruptcies, so they're proposing some highly radical fixes. They're asking for a targeted debt jubilee to literally cancel the loans for businesses that lost all their physical assets in the war.
A total wipeout.
Yeah, and they want the government to establish a bad bank, and they're begging for an immediate freeze on all foreclosures.
Let's clarify what a bad bank actually is, because it sounds like an insult, but it's a standard macroeconomic tool.
Right, it's not a bank that's behaving badly.
No, it's essentially a state-backed financial quarantine zone.
Yes.
The government creates an entity to buy up all these toxic, non-performing loans from the commercial banks at a steep discount.
Which cleans up the commercial bank's balance sheets.
Exactly. So they can actually start lending money again to rebuild the economy, while the state slowly figures out how to manage or write off the toxic debt.
Because if they don't do something structural like that, the chamber is warning that these toxic assets won't stay isolated in Tigray. They will spread across bank balance sheets nationwide, eroding capital reserves and potentially freezing credit access for the entire country.
Precisely. Furthermore, executing mass foreclosures in a completely war-torn region might not even recover the bank's capital.
Because who's going to buy the property?
Right. Think about the local liquidity. The regional economy is so incredibly weak that property values are severely depressed. The banks might spend millions in legal fees to seize these properties, only to find there is literally no one in the region with the capital to buy them at auction.
It's a devastating collision. The bank is strictly following the necessary mathematical rules of finance, but those rules are being aggressively applied to a landscape where the fundamental laws of a functioning economy were suspended by conflict.
It proves definitively that standard technical fixes, like just giving someone a 6-month extension on a loan, are completely useless when the underlying collateral and the productive capacity to generate revenue have been physically destroyed.
It really does. Which brings us full circle on today's deep dive into the pages of Addis Fortune. We've looked at elite parents fighting tooth and nail against the state to protect a specific curriculum pathway for their kids.
We've seen local businesses left standing in line waiting for a single printing press to churn out mandatory QR codes just so they can legally sell goods.
Yep. We've watched suppliers get trapped and bankrupted by inflation in rigid 3-year government contracts. And we've seen a war-torn region facing mass foreclosures because standard banking rules simply cannot process the reality of a destroyed economy.
Every single one of these stories, across entirely different sectors, highlights the exact same incredible friction. The friction between designing a pristine policy on paper in a quiet office and actually trying to enforce it on the ground, in the chaotic noise of the real world.
It really leaves you with something profound to chew on. If we enforce a rigid, unyielding system on a highly fluid, messy human reality, does the system eventually break the society, or does the society just adapt and break the system?
That's the ultimate question.
It is. Perhaps the ultimate sign of a truly mature legal and economic framework isn't how strictly it enforces its rules, but how intelligently it builds flexibility and shock absorbers directly into the law itself. Thank you so much for joining us for this week's deep dive from the newsroom of Addis Fortune. Keep questioning the rules, keep looking closely at the reality, and we'll catch you next time. Goodbye.